So, David Lahti, it's a pleasure to have you with us. He is at Queen's College in New York, City University of New York. He is actually one of these people that has both studied biology and philosophy, I think. So you have a PhD in moral philosophy and the philosophy of biology, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. So I think you're bringing together some of that interest in your talk, and we're very grateful to you for coming. Thank you.
So one of the strongest intuitions we have as humans is that we are in control of our own beliefs and our own actions. That's why we enjoy conversation, otherwise it would be rather dull. Our deepest and most serious or seriously important opinions and decisions are those that we call moral, by definition. And so this issue of freedom or self-control becomes most pressing when we're talking about morality. So mainly what I want to do today is talk about what I think about what an evolutionary analysis of human psychology and morality implies about moral freedom. So it's primarily a philosophy talk with a little bit of biology instead of primarily biology talk with a little bit of philosophy, which is what I'm used to giving nowadays, it seems. But you've had a lot of empiricism today, so now you're going to get sort of the other side of the coin, which is, but anyway. I believe that evolution actually gives us a reason to see moral freedom as an important and dynamic aspect of human nature, even though, as we know, our moral will is not all-powerful. It's not unassailable by any influences or anything like that. It's not immune. But first, what do I mean by morality, and what do I mean by moral freedom? By morality, I mean, very broadly, I'll define it today as the human capacity or faculty by which we run our lives. It's our chief priority setting machine. It allows us to cast judgment on the lives and opinions of ourselves and on those of others. And abstracted from this, we are thinking morally when we consider what states of affairs out there in the world are ultimately preferable to others. And so whenever we use terms like good and bad, right or wrong, ought or ought not, in their deepest or most fundamental or universal senses, we are expressing moral views. So that's not going to be new to any of you because we all share this as human beings. Now, moral freedom, I think, means two things, or at least that's the way I'm going to present it today. But both can be seen as the ability to go either way when you come to a fork in the road, just like this. Now, the first meaning is the freedom to construct, reconstruct, modify our belief system, to have the moral beliefs that we decide to have. So, is abortion right or wrong? Does good come from God, or does it come from an explicit or implicit social contract within a society? Does what is right or wrong depend on a code of individual action, or is it more dependent on the intended consequences or actual consequences of those actions? Now, if we're free to decide on our answers to those questions, we might call this moral philosophical freedom, in the sense that our moral philosophy is our collection of opinions about what is in fact good and bad and what significance those things have for us. Now, this is a subset, of course, of the more general concept that we're able to construct and change our opinions on anything whatsoever. So, as I alluded to before, if you're a strong opponent to that kind of freedom, there's really no chance of purposely changing your own ideas or convincing anybody else of them too. So your presence at this workshop would be a little superfluous. Or you should consider it superfluous. Maybe there might be other people who would disagree. The second sense of moral freedom is not of belief, but of action. The freedom to approach a moral decision or a decision that has a moral element to it, and then make a choice. Should I inform the shopkeeper that he has undercharged me? Should I order my country into war? Should I say this angry thing that I have in mind? To the extent that these decisions have a moral element, the question is to what extent we have control over our behavior, our response. We might call this our practical moral freedom, the freedom of moral practice as opposed to what we think. Now, first of all, without belaboring a negative argument, I'll claim that there's no biological or scientific data that have ever posed a serious challenge to moral freedom in either the moral philosophical sense or in the practical sense. Despite striking claims in news headlines and even scientific papers that suggest or might appear to suggest the contrary. But I should mention that this question of freedom of moral philosophy or freedom of your action is not the same as asking whether we can control our passions or emotions. That's a different question. So, for instance, we could investigate aggressive feelings or the emotional tug that babies elicit, or attraction towards the same members of the same sex, or predilection for addiction to alcohol, for instance, the strength of desire for alcohol. We could investigate to what extent those feelings are influenced by inheritance or acquired through experience, and we could figure out to what extent individuals can control those feelings, and if people generally, or if an average number of people, or a certain statistical threshold of people tend to just go with their feelings, then you could even look at behavior, and you may very well find a correlation. But that does not impinge on moral freedom. It's still asking questions about feelings, and it's not asking a question about whether and to what extent we are in control of our actual violent behavior or sexual behavior or parental behavior or what we consume. And of course, it's not asking at all whether we're controlling how we color these things morally or what we think about them. And so, for instance, let's say that scientists have discovered that violent feelings are influenced to a certain degree by variation in the genotype, by certain genome modifications that are passed on in the egg, by the early fetal environment in the womb, by early childhood experiences, especially with one's parents, and then later in adolescence by especially one's peer group. Let's say there's this cocktail of influences on your feelings, and let's say further that feelings of violence are very difficult for humans to extinguish immediately after they arise, and they're more difficult for some people than others. Still, these aren't studies of belief or of freedom of action. All we've done is demonstrate the sources and strength of certain feelings. In fact, also research is just being commenced, or just beginning in all of these areas, and so we can't make any general pronouncements on them right now. But my point is just that the results of these lines of research won't have more than just limited consequences for moral freedom. It would still be very possible for someone to accept all of those results and still believe that we can overcome our feelings when it comes to how we behave and what we think about such behaviors. Now, there's a lot more to be said here, such as mental disorders, or some cases in which even somebody who would believe in robust moral freedom might not think that someone could overcome certain things. But we'll move on. I just wanted to set this aside at first so that you can be cognizant of the distinction. Now, of course, there are some researchers who do believe that are using other sorts of methods, and they do believe that they've undermined conscious choice altogether. And so moral freedom would necessarily go right out with it. There's one of them. Now, when we talk about free will, practically nobody, except maybe a couple theologians and maybe a couple philosophers, really think that our decisions are made completely independently of any outside influences. That's not generally what we mean by free will, even though it sounds like it. Even most of us understand that we're not even aware of some of our influences, and that those influences can come from various points, and we can inherit some of them, and some of them can be acquired during lifetimes. But some authors need to make a big splash, or want to make a big splash, which is often done by presenting extreme and easily understood ideas to the public. And you can do this by arguing against one radical extreme idea and then showing evidence that that can't be true, and then concluding the opposite extreme and radical idea. So, for instance, an author, we don't have to say any names here, just in case the persons just have audio. Today, you could argue against a superhuman, disembodied will that's invincible and can't be swayed by any influences, a will that not too many people believe in anyway, and then show that we're not always aware of our influences and that sometimes we think too much of our own mental powers, which is true, and then conclude that consciousness is in fact a complete bystander in the entire process of decision making, and that we not only don't have free will, but we don't have any will at all. And on this view, anyone who thinks that we make conscious decisions, regardless of the degree of influence that we have from outside sources, is equally deluded. And in terms of neuroscience, the source of evidence that is generally produced for that claim of an undermining of the ability to make a conscious choice is usually that there's a time lag from the time that one reports, a subject reports or is aware of a decision, and when certain neural firing happens that is thought to indicate action readiness. So if that neural firing happens before you report a decision or before you're aware of your decision, then the claim is that you have no power to choose. And we can talk about this later if you want. I'm not going to get into it, but I don't think those kinds of studies undermine conscious choice at all, even though we do rely on conscious choice only sometimes in our lives. There are some things, especially in mundane, day-to-day things. I mean, you would be extremely exhausted if you had to consciously choose every single thing that you did over the course of a day. And so when someone asks you just to clench your hand, which is what they ask you to do in these sorts of studies, that's basically a mundane, day-to-day thing. But even aside from that, there are other reasons to doubt these kinds of studies' influence on or relevance to will. Yeah, but anyway, the thesis. Let's get to positive talk here. So my thesis is that moral freedom is real, and it's also adaptive. That means it's functional from an evolutionary perspective, but it's imperfect. It doesn't work perfectly, and it's embattled. It is constantly under siege by, from a variety of sources. What I'd like to do is outline some insights, a sort of a list of insights one can derive from modern evolutionary biology. You can decide whether you agree with the insights, but I'm going to sort of draw them out philosophically from typical background assumptions and results from evolutionary biology, especially behavioral ecology, that is the adaptive analysis of animal behavior in the context of an organism's environment. That's the kind of biology that I do. And an evolutionary analysis of human morality in particular, which is a subset of behavioral ecology, human behavioral ecology. I think that these results, or these insights, suggest not only a compatibility with moral freedom, but suggest that it is functional and that it's an integral part of what it means to be a human being. And however, that same science also suggests that this freedom can't be interpreted as a complete lack of influence. Because of course we have many often competing influences on us. In fact, I think that these warring influences on us might be the reason why the capacity for conscious thought and choice evolved in the first place. So let's start with the embattled part. I'll try to bring a little bit of fantasy in all my talks. Some evolutionary biologists have thought that we had inherited a morally evil nature for the most part, and it was only by fighting our evolutionary heritage that we could be good. But then the tendency in the last quarter of the 20th century was the opposite, that we're often described as having inherited a good, altruistic, cooperative nature. And you still see articles, especially popularizations of biology, and in very prominent journals that describe us predominantly in this way. Now, of course, that raises the question why there's anybody out there doing bad things at all, and why we all have the temptation to do sort of antisocial or go against our pro-social influences sometimes. and why war exists, etc. But anyway, in a very typical move recently, where, and I say it's typical because equally implausible extreme views gradually wear away, it seems sometimes, writers on these topics have begun to realize that all sorts of desires, tendencies, things that we want to do, likely derive from our evolutionary heritage, and that among these, some of them we would consider good and some of them we would consider bad. I mean, most of you are thinking, well, of course, but most of these resolutions end up with an of course sort of ground after coming out of relatively simplistic extremes. So human nature as it manifests in ordinary people can perhaps be better viewed as neither one of these fantasy beings, but as both of them battling together. And that won't be a new concept to most of you, I think, from religious traditions. And many careful thinkers, not only in religious traditions, but in secular thought as well, have realized this about humans long ago. Here's Alexander Pope, for instance, placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great. He hangs between in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast. Now, the insight that presents that evolutionary biology, or that evolutionary biologists studying such thing as war and mating and aggression have finally begun to conclude, is that humans exhibit a morally mixed nature. So that would be the first point that I want to raise, that's sort of an extraction from evolutionary biology in general. The second one is even more broad. I want to step away from morality even further and address for a moment where any feature of the human mind comes from. The last 50 years of research on behavioral and psychological traits from an evolutionary perspective has, I would say, produced a workable model of how any trait arises, and we can apply it to morality just like anything else. So first of all, our mind and behavior is governed by our evolutionary history, and to that extent, human behavior is shaped partly and indirectly by genes, but we're also guided by the perceptions and ideas and other things as well, but I'll concentrate on learning right now, that we gain during our lifetime, including the influences of our culture. And some people focus on those things, and some people focus on the inherited tendencies. We should really be considering both of these and their interactions. So our evolutionary history influences how we see the world around us, and it biases how we learn. And on the other hand, the experiences that we have during our lifetime influence how our evolutionary history sort of translates into our behavior, how much we're in control of it as well, or how much it controls us as well. So the way that a biologist would state, and this is the case for any trait in any organism, even morphological traits, behavioral traits, whatever, except of course we don't generally think of learning when it comes to a lot of those, but acquisition during lifetime anyway. Now what a biology would use, the phrase a biologist would use to describe this is that our traits, including morality, are a product of evolutionary heritage and plasticity in interaction. So the nature-nurture debate is most acrimonious among people who don't understand this. And that's generally not behavioral ecologists, because that's what they do for a living. But people who are only sitting on one side or the other, and people in a lot of biology are on that side, and people in a lot of psychology are on this side, you can imagine. And then the public is trying to make sense of the combination of these things without being too biased. But it's not really too much of a debate among people who understand both sides and the interaction. Of course, we can all do that. It's just a sort of an aha moment. So the second of the insights that I want to draw out is the realization that morality, like all of our cognitive traits, results from a complex interaction between influences from our evolutionary heritage and influences that we have picked up over our lifetime. All right, now the third point that I want to make, based on the evolutionary natural history of morality, is that it is not, even though we only share it among our own members of our own species, it's not a monolithic trait from a biological perspective, from a historical perspective. but it's a conglomerate of many, many traits, some of which are very old and some of which are very recent. So you might now, with the benefit of, well, without looking backward too much and looking at what these things rest on in various ways, we might be able to construct a philosophical system that all hangs together and is logically unified, has a structure that's internally consistent. In fact, philosophers have tried to do that for 2,500 years or more. This may or may not be possible, but the ancient basic ingredients, the precursors of morality, certainly didn't come to us this way. They came to us by degrees, by little increments, and from various sources, through various mechanisms. So, for instance, the oldest feature in our own lineage that contributes significantly to our present experience of morality is motherhood, the reason we're called mammals. Lactation, yielding mother-offspring emotional bonds, is at least 135 million years old. And it's the first time, to my knowledge, in our own evolutionary lineage, all the way back to bacteria, that we have close and enduring emotional bonds between two individuals, independently evolved in birds. And so in an important sense, it's the evolutionary root of love. Now, people have argued that it might even be earlier than this because there are some bonds between even reptiles that do not have such close interactions as this, but some parental care. But I would say this is probably pretty big. And subsequently, we have also emotional bonds between parents. And they are very similar in their biochemistry. Now, of course, we wouldn't consider this morality in the animals. The point here is that our own care for our offspring and the emotional bonds we have with our mates are morally laden to us in our own position. I believe that our species and our moral nature, the things that we find valuable and that we want to preserve, didn't just plop into this world irrespective of what kind of organism we are. But it drew from our evolutionary heritage, or it was consistent with it, flowed out of it in some extent. In that context, our very real and serious moral responsibility to care for our children has a natural history that began with a 135 million year old lineage of intense parental behavior. And then at the other temporal extreme, we have the result, the product of modern human thinking, including ideas such as the equal moral considerability of all people. And most recently, in terms of official codification in the philosophical subfields and that kind of thing, and activist groups, an attention to the potential moral considerability of non-human animals and the rest of the natural world. And with respect to equal moral considerability of all people, Darwin said there is no precedence for this in nature, and so it must be taught, and must be taught assiduously. And this is a big thing for Darwin to say, because he was generally a nativist in the sense that he thought a lot of things were the product of evolutionary history and were not necessarily acquired during one's lifetime. So the third insight from evolution here is that in a biological sense, morality rests on, historically, not in terms of logic or conceptually, but historically, and maybe biologically in a sense you could say, on a conglomerate of traits or perspectives, some of which are very, very old in our lineage, and some of which are very new and even still developing today in our culture. Now, the fourth insight is, I would say, the biggest and unique to human evolution as opposed to that of any other species. And this is the consensus now. I think I used to say developing consensus, but the more I read more recent papers, I think I'll just call it a consensus from now on, that humans evolved in complex social groups that resulted in a dynamic that includes a fundamental conflict between cooperation and competition. So bear with me for a moment here on the story here. As we humans became ecologically dominant in our environment over the last 2 million years or so, we eventually became our most hostile force of nature in Darwin's terms. what that means is that in addition to adapting to predators, hunger, disease, climate, we came to evolve primarily at some point in adaptation to ever increasing competition with other members of our species. And this social competition took and still takes two general forms. There's competition within groups, within social groups for social status and for mates, and competition between groups that is associated with within-group cooperation for the purpose of or function of group cohesion. So the existence of the first sort of cooperation is more ancient. We share it with a bunch of other organisms. But it's the second kind of competition. Did I say competition? The first kind of competition is more ancient and shared. The second kind is rarer. And this group against group competition reached what I would suggest is an unprecedented level in humans that really seems to have led to the suppression of competition within a group, and thus to the rise of much more elaborate, extensive cooperation. So far, so good, but see what this means. Both mechanisms are operating at the same time. The first one, along with just about natural selection for just about every other trait, or in most contexts, that's why, is self-serving, or it favors self-service on the individual level. That's why Herbert Spencer could look at natural selection and consider it the survival of the fittest. But the second mechanism promotes group service. And that obviously can be at odds with self-service. So here we've got a painting of Karachi on the left with a guy eating a big feast, and then one by John Russell on the right with a young woman helping a blind beggar. Just to sort of illustrate self-service and group service that are both, well, it's an interplay between competition and cooperation that results in a division between self-service and group service in our nature. Do we save things for ourselves or give them to others? Both tendencies, I think, must be rather ancient in our group living species, and both tendencies evolved by natural selection, I believe. The first is probably far older, but both can be adaptive, but by different routes. The first, the one on the left, through competition within a group, and the right one, group service, by competition between groups, which fosters cooperation within a group. So these mechanisms often conflict with each other. Now let's overlay moral attributions here to fill out the picture. We might conclude that feeding oneself is selfish, and so you're good insofar as you try to get yourself to do more of the right at the expense of the left. But there's a problem with that. We regard feeding ourselves as also moral, permissible, and even good in and of itself. It's not evil. Even, matter of fact, feeding one's own offspring also evolved through the very same evolutionary mechanism. But on the other hand, hurting an innocent person for our own gain, or even such as out of jealousy, like this Cain and Abel painting there, we would consider evil or bad. And whereas we all would consider helping others to be morally praiseworthy, racism and xenophobia, such as this illustration of abuse of slaves and even the ownership of slaves, of course, in this engraving by William Wells Brown on the right, are common in humans because they fostered group cohesion in our history. They fostered the advancement of a particular social group in history. That's a group benefit. So the take-home message here is that despite the fact that key aspects that underlie our morality evolved in the context of a conflict between group and individual routes to reproductive success, we can't look at those separate mechanisms by which a particular attitude or behavior spread in our species in order to derive our moral codes. So it necessitates some sort of choice. We can't look at evolution and have it tell us that there's any logic to where the mechanism is producing the morality. The products of our evolution cannot predict our moral response to them. We decide where to put good and bad in this story. In some cases, we might decide to build upon the raw material that we have genetically and culturally inherited, and in other cases, we might decide to combat it. So the conflict between adaptive cooperation and competition constitutes an important and probably the very oldest source of conflict that would have made, in my view, the capacity for moral choice functional and adaptive. But this isn't the end of the story. The evidence suggests that we humans have mechanisms that specifically function to modulate, mollify, or lessen this conflict between group interests and individual interests, these two different routes to reproductive success. So I'll just discuss two. First, the principle of stability-dependent cooperation. Humans tend to lean more towards group service goals when their social group is threatened. And when their group is stable, they tend more towards self-service goals. You can think about groups within a society, see whether that might be the case, and different nations or even a single nation at different times. And we have often displays during threats to a group that synchronize and rally cooperative behavior in a way that we don't see as often when the group is stable or not threatened. Now, my point isn't that this is a morally good thing to do, this variation. My point here is to say that these changes are predicted by evolution and they require modulation of behavior. They require changes in decisions at different times. Whether we even agree with it or realize it or not, we tend to be modulated by the stability of our social groups, as evolutionary social psychology would predict. Secondly is indirect reciprocity. That's when the benefits to us by being pro-social and the costs to us of being antisocial are delivered back to us not just by individual people that we're interacting with, but indirectly through other people who see us or know us, and by the society as a whole, by our social institutions. They deliver the costs and benefits to us. So the most important enforcement program doesn't tend to be official social institutions, however. It tends to be reputation. What people think of you. What people think of us drastically affects our lives, and it's tended to drastically affect our behavior. And popular culture echoes this as well, such as to remind us of the importance of reputation, such as religious groups can, or if you're selling something potentially detrimental, then to claim that it will not affect your reputation, as the typical Las Vegas signs have done for a while now. Now, I would say that stability-dependent cooperation and indirect reciprocity govern the operation of the typical non-reflective human's morality, you might say, or behavior on a day-to-day basis, perhaps even throughout the world. Some people think there's significant cultural diversity in this, but not that this is necessarily a good thing, mind you. And there are also, social scientists and evolutionary biologists have also noticed other things that modify morality that are also relevant to mention here, although their particular relevance won't become clear to moral freedom until a little bit later on. I just want to go through them really quickly. So first of all, if your group is stable but you have a sudden threat, it could, evolutionary economists have shown that, game theorists, that there could be a race to the bottom. And so as an insurance against sudden threats, one would predict that we would have moral absolutism, that, or this is predicted to be something that could dampen the effect of sudden threats, considering that we might be in too selfish of a state during a period of group stability to be able to shore up our groups. So if we have moral absolutism, meaning that good is the same in all times and all places for all people, this could dampen this effect. Same as moral viscosity, so you're less subject to changing your views on a whim. Then there's also the possibility of deception. People have talked about, this is a hot topic right now, that people's moral views, they have a certain uncertainty about what they should do or uncertainty about their moral views because of the potential for deception. There's also potential that we're deceiving ourselves into thinking something that is the case when we just want it to be the case. And then, of course, there's at least 200 years of intense study, especially from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, on the importance of power differentials in influencing morality. The fact that through fear or coercion, morality of an individual or group could be warped by those more powerful. This last one I want to talk about a little bit more. I want to expand on this one. Genetic evolution is slow, but our social environment changes very quickly. So many of our inherited desires or tendencies are only adaptive in a past environment and not so much in our present one. And as a result, we've instituted rules that are designed by humans deliberately to take up the slack. In other words, as a way of updating our behavior to where we want it to be. So one example that's not particularly moral, I mean, you could think of it as moral perhaps. We've evolved in a time or place, in place where there's a strong desire for sweetness would ensure that we looked for fruit and ate it only at its most nutritious time when it had the maximum amount of sugar, and sugar was very important for our energy, carbohydrates of course. Today we have refined sugar in such high quantities whenever we want it, and so it has become a little less good for us, obviously, and we tell our kids not to eat too much sugar. We wouldn't have had to do this but for the disconnect between the environment of today and the environment of our distant ancestors. So I'd argue that moral institutions can be often very much like this. So we often socially promote behaviors that are adaptive today, but nevertheless at odds with behaviors that might have been adaptive in our evolutionary history. So our institutions of marriage and promises and displays of fidelity, our social enforcement of child support after divorce might be instances of this. We don't have to wear rings to tell us to eat every day because that is consistent with our evolutionary heritage. This might be, our monogamy might be somewhat less. Now, according to paleontological and other evidence, we have been evolving to become more monogamous for quite some time. But the fact that men are still 15 to 20% larger than women, depending on the society, that polygyny, one man having several wives, is vastly more common than polyandry, one woman having many husbands, in that men are on average far more sexually forward than women, all suggest that we still bear some vestiges of our typical mammalian polygyny. But evidence today does suggest that our children do better if they are raised by both parents better than one, and that this is most likely to be the case when there is a strong emotional bond just between two people. Hence, our ancient dispositions can pose problems when we enter the modern social environment, and so cultural institutions can come to our rescue in these cases. So I would predict that the moral rules we most often preach, we hold a lot of things to be good and right, but the moral rules we most often preach in our society are precisely the ones that are at odds with behavioral dispositions that might have been more adaptive in our evolutionary history than they are now. And that's why we preach them. Morality in this case functions partly as a cultural surrogate for adaptation. We're not going to wait around for our emotions to catch up to our morality and our understanding of what is good and bad, or what is best for us. So our culture can be an updating mechanism. Morality can be an updating mechanism. Okay, so here's where it all comes together, I hope. I've been talking about a lot of different things here, but here's my conclusion. All of the features that I just described about human social behavior, the human situation, collectively suggest that moral freedom is real and that it is adaptive or helps us survive in this unique social environment that we've created for ourselves. The history has been one of competing interests, conflicting desires, a need for flexibility and plasticity, multiple sources of our tendencies, changing environments. So these circumstances, our social world, I would argue, is too complex for us to navigate it effectively with anything less than active conscious thought and decision. It's unprecedented in the world of organisms, on Earth anyway. For simpler or more ancient situations, we could rely on built-in algorithms that we might not even need to be aware of in some cases. We would not need to be conscious of them or think about them. But deliberate conscious thinking is how we do the very complex things for which our algorithms would fall short or conflict with each other. We have no evolved shortcut in some cases. So in fact, the navigation of social situations is widely seen as the reason why we humans are so intelligent and have consciousness in the first place, why we are so aware of ourselves, why we are so acutely and sometimes laboriously conscious in the formation of our beliefs and our decisions. So I'm going to present 8 reasons based only on the prehistory and functions of our moral capacity that I've laid out today that tend to lead us to this frown, this conscious moral thinking. And this is R.M. Hare, a 20th century philosopher who wrote a book called Moral Thinking. So these are reasons why I believe that conscious thought and hence moral freedom are functional, and we have an evolutionary argument for thinking that it probably is real. So I'm going to list them in roughly increasing order of how much I think they influence us today, or how they affect us, how those issues cause tensions within us, particularly in safe but socially competitive places like Cambridge. So it might not be always the same for everybody here. So the least important, I'm claiming, is fear of those in power. That's not the least for a lot of people, of course. And these are non-moral things. So I'm assuming that these things came about before we had full-fledged moral freedom, and they made moral freedom ratchet up its functional significance or importance. So these are non-moral things that would force us to have to make choices about our decisions on a day-to-day basis. Fear of those in power, uncertainty about group stability, because whether your group is more or less stable is a difficult thing to assess, and yet it determines the functionality of your different behaviors. Then you have conflicting loyalties to different groups. We talked about group service versus self-service, but we have different kinds of social groups, and they often cut across each other and conflict. Then there's uncertainty due to deception. We don't know whether we have all the information or whether we have the right information because of deception. Then there's ingrained moral absolutism and viscosity, that we might distrust that, or that might lead us to be slow in accepting new information and updating our behavior. We have, of course, uncertainty about impacts on our reputation. Henry Fielding believed that this was the most important variable in different people's morality. In other words, not knowing whether people were going to find out and being differentially careful. Number 7, conflict between group and individual goals. I said this was the oldest source of conflict, and it is still, I would argue today, is still important. And then my pet one that I presented at the end was the novel cultural milieu that we have built for ourselves produces, influences, or changes the structure of what adaptive behavior would be relative to our ancient environment, and so that can produce conflicts as well. Now, imagine all of these issues separately creating conflicts, and then, because we're talking about only one individual performing one kind of behavior, all of their interactions and levels of conflict with each other, and these are only the biological or psychological pre-moral considerations, not even the philosophical or theological ones, because those must have arisen after moral freedom was already ours thoroughly, right? So thus we talk about moral tension, moral ambiguity, and so on, and 2,500 years plus of moral philosophers wrangling and struggling with what is good and what it means. We need our moral thought. We have needed our moral freedom. One more point. Sometimes something's importance can be shown by shutting it down. So geneticists knock out genes to show that what those genes do. It's not a perfect way to do things, but it works to some extent. In the same way, there's some circumstantial evidence for moral freedom purely in the fact that it can fail. As we all know, there are several ways that we can have muddied moral waters, frequent cases where we're not sure what alternative is good, what we ought to do in this particular case, or even if we do realize that, we might have difficulty doing it. We might fail in an effort to be or do what we believe is right. Now, Socrates, according to Plato and Protagoras, said that one cannot act wrongly or badly while knowing that one is doing so. And that was somewhat consistent with his overall philosophy, and that would be consistent with an absence of moral freedom that some writers are charging today. But Aristotle noticed that this is contrary to all appearances. We do apparently often fail to do what we believe is right. We experience sometimes a loss of self-control. And this is called akrasia in Greek. It's not received much testing or analysis from neuroscientists, and probably not surprisingly, no offense to neuroscientists, but they tend to be more interested in dismantling will rather than finding its weaknesses. Nevertheless, the record of human experience and the opinions of most philosophers today suggest that we should be on the side of Aristotle rather than Socrates on this one. So here's John Searle, for example. Akrasia in rational beings is as common as wine in France. Now, free will to many philosophers is a binary matter. You either have it or you don't. But at least as a practical thing, it is not a binary matter. We can have the power of decision without our decision being uninfluenced by various factors. In fact, that's the reason for akrasia. That's what that means, weakness of the will, presumably because of these factors impinging upon it. The fact that we can experience weakness, though, suggests the possibility for strength. Like C.S. Lewis said, it would be a very strange world where you could feel hunger and there'd be no food. Whether we admit our own failure, we've demonstrated our standard of success, and thus we've demonstrated our moral will and our fragile, embattled, but real moral freedom. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, David. So we've got some questions. Okay, Rob again.
Thank you very much. I'd be interested to hear your take on how the pathologies inform this idea of free will with a biological basis versus, the sort of acquired moral basis, social basis, philosophical basis, kind of along the lines of that slide you showed where the behavioral ecologists will have one idea and the psychologist another. And then when you know both, there's really not much to argue about. Anyways, the pathology I have in mind is a psychopath who maybe for biological reasons, so some problem with receiving oxytocin in his brain. And this is a very empirical question. I don't know the answer. If you ask such an individual, is it wrong to commit atrocity X, and will they answer, yes, it's wrong, but I still want to do it? Mm-hmm. So that's the question. Will a psychopath recognize some element of morality while still having the urge to not to obey this moral code?
That's a good question, and that's a difficult question. Pathology in general, I often get asked that here when we talk about morality. When we ask the question, do humans walk? And we say, yes, humans walk, you always have to keep in the back of your mind that some humans do not walk, but that you have to be sensitive in how you talk about this, but it is usual or normal for humans to be able to walk past a certain age, up to a certain age. And in the same way, I would say that we can talk about what is typical or develops normally in the absence of insult in the human brain and thus mind. And I would be hesitant to suggest that any combination of pathologies, whether in the recognition of right or wrong or the commitment to it, because that's where you were splitting here, aren't possible. I would be hesitant to say that any aren't possible, because although it would cause me a little discomfort to see that it is possible for some naturally occurring pathology to result in someone saying, yes, this is wrong, and yet I still have no compunction in doing it, I recognize that this is within the realm of theoretical possibility. Now, how I would integrate that sort of morally myself or philosophically, I don't know how I would do it. It would be, I would feel somewhat the same as we feel when we come down with something purely physical that we object to, and yet we just don't have an explanation for it. That's about as far as I can go with it.
Did you have a question? Yeah, yeah. Elaine?
Someone else first?
No, it's Elaine, you were next.
Yeah, I have a couple of
Could you use the microphone?
Sure, happy to. This is a great talk, and I hope you do some public writing, because it seems like these issues are so popular right now. And I wonder if you have any perhaps musings on why neuroscientists are so interested in disproving free will, is one kind of question I have.
Mm-hmm.
And then a question about the automatic aspects of character. I'm not sure I have it right, but I'm thinking about perhaps an Aquinian notion of character, where maybe the highest form of morality in one sense is the kind of automatic moral commitment. So it's not like I need to make a decision every day not to murder someone. It seems sort of automatic, although I can imagine the
Mm-hmm.
conditions under which that would then become a very deliberate act of free will, right?
Right.
You know, say if my child was being attacked in front of me or something. I mean, I can imagine conditions under which that would not be an automatic
That's
moral
right.
decision.
Yeah, it's interesting that issue. I'll deal with the second one first, because I probably will forget the first one. But yeah, so this idea of whether it is morally superior to go against, to have to consciously choose to do something in the face of contrary influences. That's a Kantian idea. You do it out of duty, not because you wanted to do it, and not because it was habitual. That's, for some people, that is the sort of highest moral action. Other people who think more about character, and so virtue ethicists, I would say probably Aristotle would be like this as well, would think that if you cultivate a behavioral pattern by habit until it is part of your character, you have created an edifice of goodness, essentially, within you. And the fact that you don't have to be very conflicted about it every single time you come to the road is something that is, good on you, kind of thing. So, and I don't know how I feel about that, because I do recognize when someone stops drinking after many years of alcoholism, and they are struggling every day for the first, for however many months or years they have to do that. And maybe it never goes away, maybe it gets easier, but I have almost more respect for that than somebody who comes from a teetotaler family and never has to deal with alcoholism, with respect to that one issue. Now, but I do have a certain empathic sort of resonance with both sorts of views. Maybe there's different ways to be morally excellent. I don't know, but that is a good point. And I didn't bring up character, and I was thinking of doing it. It's a very good point to bring in here, and it probably does have some. The fact that character is possible, that things can be grown of habit, is probably because of this. What some people say of the labor of conscious thought, the fact that that it's tough to do, and you would rather not have to do it. Musicians always say that they want to be able to play without thinking about it. And matter of fact, if they think about it, sometimes they will mess up. I know that's true of myself in a lot of things, including giving talks. If I think too much about listening to myself up here, I'm in danger of do it anymore, right? So the labor of conscious thought can hold us back. So character is a very wonderful thing. I think was why our neuroscientists, yes. For it, I'll give one that it comes out of a man. We are taught things in particular, and then evolution, cell biology, these kinds of things, as the like, for instance, in my own department, as in most biology departments, it's split now. But now EEB and MCD. So in other words, ecology, evolution, and behavior, some might say, and then molecular, cell, and developmental on the other. And of course, biology party, we talk about who's better. And of course, EEB is better, but so when you have neuroscientists that are finding out brain regions that are correlating with reported actions, we biologists have long been critical of the social sciences for just relying on reports. Neuroscientists rely on reports too, but anyway, not having strong, empirically grounded hypothetical frameworks to ask their questions. Stick it to the social scientists or even the humanities, which have no scientific method at all, then filling in one of those gaps in knowledge that the philosophers and the theologians and everything were occupying before. So there's this idea of, if you the route by which your results, then you are more likely going to hit the jackpot in terms of meaning and that kind of thing. So if someone said just, you could imagine one of these, I asked somebody to throw a ball and to catch a ball, and as they did it, between the brain regions, and are brighter in people that throw balls better or faster than if for athleticism or something like that. It's much better. We found the neuronal, or the little population, this is the athleticism neuronal population or something like that. It's much more snazzy, just like when geneticists do the same thing with the gene for, or like the gay gene or the motherhood gene or the violence gene or whatever. So.
Other question, right at the back, and then we'll come up to the front.
How much evidence, hard evidence, is there for a genetic component to these human behaviors, as opposed to what you called a cultural surrogate, or cultural algorithms that are simulating evolutionary stable strategies?
Yeah, so that's that's probably the weakest part of most of behavioral ecology or behavioral evolution. And that is, so on the empirical side, I study culturally evolved behavior, such as bird song. And that is actually the changes are a combination of genetic changes and socially learned changes and individual innovation and unlearned things that they pick up from the environment. And I don't know how to partition those. I treat that essentially as a black box. And the evolutionary predictions that evolutionary ecology would make and that behavioral ecology would make is regardless of the mechanism. Regardless of the mechanism, in this environment we predict this. That's the kind of thing. And in the past, people have assumed that it was genetic evolution in some cases. And it probably is, genetic evolution probably plays a larger role the older the thing we're looking at is, and the change over the longer period of time. And as time is much shorter, we would expect to see a much stronger cultural element. So for instance, the feelings of motherhood, or the feelings of attachment to babies and those biochemical bases, I assume those evolved largely genetically because they're shared with tens of thousands of other organisms and they're very old. Whereas our ideas that we probably all share in this room, that all people are equally morally considerable, that's a pretty recent idea, and it probably did not evolve genetically, or if anything, there were pre-adaptations that we essentially called upon, like ones that were originally evolved for getting along with our close associates, that we have then repurposed in society. And those kind of interactions are possible too, which double the difficulty of distinguishing the evolutionary mechanism.
Thank you.
Well, we've only got time probably for one more question, so we'll come here.
David, thank you. Isn't part of the process of evolution driven by what I would call tradition and expectation? Just to give you an example, you can say Italy hasn't got a great tenor at the moment, but you know very well, given the way that Italian society absolutely craves great tenors, that is going to arrive. So doesn't a lot of human behavior depend on not so much neurological and biological things, but on expectation and tradition?
That's a good point, although I would say that strictly speaking, if we're talking about genetic evolution here, as opposed to cultural evolution, which is just passing social learned things on, it's not really evolution, it just looks like it. I mean, it resembles genetic evolution, so we call it evolution. But so if we're talking specifically about genetic evolution, there's no expectation, but there is what we could call pre-adaptation, meaning that there are certain organisms that are more likely to go to the next step in a particular environment than other organisms. So once we got, for instance, to the point where we were living in small, close-knit groups and interacted with other associates, even those who weren't closely related to us, through our sort of reciprocal alliances and those sorts of things, I would say that we were already primed, probably in many different ways, in our brains and the rest of our bodies and our social, our sociality, to go to a next step of interacting and finding some sort of common ground with other groups and coming together to form partnerships, either through sharing brides or in warfare or in group hunting, that kind of thing. So in other words, each step probably made more likely the step ahead of it. I wouldn't expect to see the same types of trajectories being maintained in random species throughout the Earth. But that I would say that would be an evolutionary reinterpretation of your idea of expectation.
Okay, on that note, I think we'll say thanks again to David very much for his talk.
Thank you.